Okay.
So I want to tell you about one of my most heard scriptures growing up. And it comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And it says this, and whenever I say the scripture, it's always in the King James Version because I heard it so often in that version. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that formed the basis of much of my early understanding of religion, to get rid of the sin that is making you non-perfect. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. The two different topics that for the day are the original sin and about the virgin birth, both of which are trying to talk about how do we get rid of the sin that you are, that you do, that is rampant. How about yourselves? Where were you raised with the avoidance of and the fixing of sin being present with you? How was that true about your growing up? Anybody else have something like that?
No, but I'm grateful that I didn't. And it sounds really strange to be grateful to be unchurched as a child, but I did not go to Sunday school or church. My dad was Catholic and my mom was not, so we just didn't go. My dad went all the time to mass, but so I didn't have that legacy. And so it's been easier to explore as an adult with some other information going on than to have memorized it as a child and believe the adults. Because I am a believer in what the grown-ups would have told me. I would have probably swallowed it whole.
Yeah.
So
that's part of the difficulty, isn't it? That if we tell somebody something enough times as a child, it just becomes, of course that's true because.
Well, and sometimes it only takes one time telling them.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
depends on the child and how much they hold the adult in esteem. And it's just makes me very careful about what I say to kids.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that you're careful about that, because I think that how we've handled sin has often been at the expense of each other.
Yeah.
How about the rest of you? What kind of things did you learn growing up that way?
I don't ever remember, even though I grew up in what I consider to be a pretty religious family, both of my parents, my mother had grown up in the Methodist church and my father in the EUB church, and I was baptized in the EUB church, and that's where we went till we moved to New Jersey. And then I went to Methodist. And I had an infant baptism, but I never remember anybody saying anything about original sin or anything like that in my family or even in the church. I don't remember it. They may have, but I don't remember it. And so when I started learning that Catholics believed that the baptism was to take away that original sin, it seemed sort of odd to me, because I always felt that baptism was like a dedication of your child to this life, rather than that it was to save you from some horrible thing that happened because you're a human being. And so that, to me, that part about, original sin was never really part of my upbringing, even though, we went to church, and even as a teenager, I was in church like 3 or 4 times a day between NYF and everything else. But no, that was not really part of it.
And that's because Methodism, as well as much of Protestantism, original sin, while we may believe in it, we don't put as much emphasis on it because that's a Catholic thing. We don't think of it as much as what Catholics do. And so that helps us in that area. It's not that we don't have problems, because many Methodists become much more of the evangelical, you're a sinner, you need to be saved. which is the same type of thing. It just doesn't use the words original sin as much. It assumes that you are, that doing wrong is more your truth than doing right.
Hmm. I guess I was very lucky.
Yeah, yeah. Martha, how about you?
Oh, I was trying to think about that. I don't know if it, I remember when I was like in high school, I started going to some Bible study classes that were led by the pastor. And I think I was Methodist now then. I switched back and forth between Methodist and Presbyterian because that was the conflict between my parents. And it was whatever church was closest to us.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
anyway, I was the one who walked to church and went to church, as opposed to anybody else in my family for some reason. And I in high school, I was in MYF, president of MYF, of course. But I also attended some adult Bible study groups. And I remember some discussion about that. And I I understood about what baptism was about, but I didn't understand why a baby would be born with sin, you
Yeah.
know? I never quite accepted that.
That's that speaks well of you. Because the reality is it's hard to look at a baby and for me at least and see evil,
Oh, yeah.
right? I mean, it becomes increasingly easier to see evil as people grow, but at a baby,
Mhm.
that's not where I see the horns and the forked tail.
What,
Uh-huh.
my best friend in high school was Baptist, so of course she was baptized much later. And I mean, obviously the Baptists must believe in original sin, but they're not believing that baptism is cleansing you of this sin, or are they?
I'm sorry, I had to fix Melissa.
You didn't do a very good job.
Sorry, I got distracted.
Well, because, Baptists and some other groups do not do infant baptism, are they still pushing baptism as a thing of washing you of your sins, or is it some other thing that they're saying?
Most Protestant groups, including the ones who do not do infant baptism, see that as a washing you of your sins. Yes.
Okay.
Why is it that sin becomes what we inherently look at someone having rather than something different? Let me go back to that scripture that I told you. Be ye therefore perfect. And we tell all kinds of stories about how a single drop of ink on a white piece of cloth will ruin it. That single sin somehow sullies us. The word perfect in that scripture is the word teleos. And teleos could be translated as perfect, but a better translation is probably whole or complete, like a full circle. I like that definition of sin much better than what we do. We use sin as a blemish. And I think for the writer of that passage, which my mom and dad never understood this way, is what makes you less than complete. What makes it so that you still have room to grow? Because you can look at a baby, for example, and while I can't see evil in them, I can see growth necessary, right? What are they going to grow into? What are they going to become? And so as I looked at first graders coming into my room, I wouldn't look at how evil they are and I've got to fix their evil. I would look and say, what is it that they don't know?
Yes.
Where do they need to grow and how do they need to become? The hard part is that that's not the tact that we've often had in churches. Our tactic in churches has often been, how are they bad and how do we fix each other? Instead of, what is it that, how do we continue to help each other to grow? How is someone incomplete? Why is it easy for us to go the one way instead of another?
Excuse me a second. I need to get this dog quieted.
Okay. Because I should be fair about first grade, and Judy, you can back me up. It doesn't take long with certain kids to be able to want to say they're evil, because certain kids are just difficult, aren't they?
I didn't call many of them evil,
I didn't either, but
but difficult, yeah. Challenging, yeah. Yeah,
and so I think it's that type of thing where we are very challenging to each other, and it somehow makes it easier for us to be able to look at each other and say, that's evil, rather than saying that's somebody who needs to grow. That's someone who's incomplete. And if I'm honest, there's something in there that they didn't have, because much of what we call evil sometimes is a function of poverty, for example. A function of bad parenting that continued on to the next generation. A function of cultural norms that don't match. You know, all kinds of other things, but it's much simpler just to say evil rather than relate to the person, isn't it?
Yes, I sort of equate evil truly as someone who deliberately hurts someone else in some way, rather than they're doing something that irritates someone else. You know, that they haven't, there's an intentionality about it. And so that makes it hard for me to believe that, you know, that is evil. And this incompleteness, meaning for the word, I think, for perfect or imperfect, I think is really a good way to look at it. And I wish it had been translated that way hundreds of years ago. But of course, part of this is the church controlling people too. And certainly in the early years of the church, that was a big thing.
And we're going to get to that. So let's hold that for a second, because you're right that part of this is, what does the church do with it? The other part, though, is what do we do with, for example, in my case, Mike Burgle, who in 8th grade was bullying me. And he was very intentionally doing that. Was he evil? Or was he an 8th grader who was a pain in the ass, like some 8th graders sometimes are? And how do we get them past that? From my perspective, he felt evil.
Oh, yes.
He felt wrong. And so it's easy just to, from that perspective, put him into that space of God doesn't love him. He's going to hell type of space. But is that helpful to him or just convenient for me?
well, also, is it helpful to you?
Is it helpful to me? Yeah.
Because if anybody can be consigned there, he might consign you there
You might.
just as easily.
And isn't that the problem, though, is that it's really easy for all of us to consign someone, right? Because we all know reasons why that person's not worthy enough to be in whatever I think of as my place of reward.
Well, our former president really stretched me in that direction because I still try hard not to see him as evil, but as damaged.
Yeah.
That he operates out of a system that was totally unhealthy and doesn't know the difference. Or
Judy, you're
blatantly
an angel.
No, I don't know. This is work I have to do for myself, because it's really easy for me to say, ain't it awful? Isn't he awful?
Sure.
And his behavior is wretched to me. I just,
Mhm.
you know, I obviously I don't even say his name very pleasantly, but he didn't get there by accident. He didn't,
No.
and I'm not even sure that he chose that.
Well, and I think that it's helpful to be able to remember that, because, okay, so if we go back to where we were at, first grade, you look at the kid who's really failing in your class. Oftentimes it is not intelligence that is the deciding factor in that. It is something else that someone has given them or caused them to see about themselves, or choices that were made often by parents or by the environment around them, that's helped that to be the space. And I'm not trying to forgive the behavior of the child. I'm just trying to say that very often it's a much larger story than just that one child's behavior. And so I think you're right, Judy, that in most cases, there's something there that helped them to become who they are. And do I work with that person to help them unbecome, or do I treat them as going to hell?
Well, thank goodness I don't have to work with him.
Yeah.
I have to, but I have to work on myself. Because the easy way for me is just to say it's black and white and there's no way for him to be forgiven or whatever.
Yeah.
But that takes it away from a whole lot of people that I don't like.
Right. Because my biggest thing is not him, because he's been the one who has made this, who was mass produced the problem in our world today. But there are a whole lot of people who have also been there and chosen that. And so how do I work in that space with each of the individuals that are there without doing that further damaging of assigning them to political hell, whether or not I believe in a spiritual hell? It's really hard for us to escape from all of this original evil thing, because it's become so permeated in our society that it's simple to be able to say, of course that person is. And we have that wonderful repository of hell, however we define that, to be able to place all those people. I don't have to fix them. They're going to get there. Even if we put it in nice karmic terms of, you know, the evil they do will bounce back to them type of thing. Still, it's the sense of, do I see them as the worst of who they are? Or do I draw them towards the best of who they are? What is it that I use to be able to interact with that other person? I guess what I'm asking is this essential question. Is each person that I meet inherently evil or inherently good? And most of the Garden of Eden theology, the original sin theology, says inherently bad. That somehow we have inherited from our ancestors evil. So what's your experience?
Mm.
Well, I think for me, first grade was where I needed to be all those years. Because I could look at small people and realize they had a lot of growing to do and they weren't all going to do it in my classroom. And they certainly weren't going to be completed there.
Yeah.
But I still have a
Even,
hard
even
time.
if they did first grade perfectly, Judy, because they could do everything, get 100 on every single assignment, every single task, and you knew
Yeah,
that they were not finished.
Yeah, they still had more to do, and I could be comfortable with that. And the reason I never became a principal, I probably have told this story several times, is because I didn't trust myself to have that same attitude toward people who were as tall as I am or close to as tall as I am.
Yeah.
That I have expectations for adults that they should at least be working at it. You know, I give kids more credit for having time to get there.
Yeah.
I didn't have that same patience with grown-ups necessarily. So it's good I never became a principal, because I would have just told people that weren't doing a good job, you go sit in the office, I'll teach this class.
It's hard not to get to that space, isn't it?
It is for me.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question too about whether Adam and Eve really, I mean, they were disobedient, but were they really bad?
Yeah.
Uh,
Actually, what is the story that's being told there? Is it one of bad? Or is it a different story that's being told?
and in truth, the snake told the truth and God didn't. So
Yeah.
I mean, I have a problem with that as well. I mean, it's a folk tale, let's face it. And that's part of the problem there, that we read so much into this, which is maybe relating about why people misbehave. And so they say, well, it's because this original person was disobedient. And so we've always been disobedient. And being disobedient is not the same thing as being evil. And I think that, you know, that's certainly a milder way of looking at this Garden of Eden story, that this is, I mean, yeah, they equate the snake with being evil, but that's just man's feeling about snakes. I think that how he got into that
I
story.
think so too. We try to take what is absolutely a mythic story, Adam and Eve, and we try to turn it into literal truth in some way or
I
another.
know, isn't it crazy?
Yeah, that somebody took a bite of an apple and that somehow that changed the whole world. Not just in that instance, but for all time.
And how does that fit with our view of the cosmos now?
How does that fit with our view of the cosmos is exactly the question that John Shelby Spong is asking, right? He's trying to say that that's an unworkable definition of that.
Not what we know about what the universe now.
Right. And that there's so many other ways that are better about that. What do we learn from Adam and Eve that can help us? Right? It's that we're growing, I think, that we are evolving human beings, that Adam and Eve were in this space where they're moving towards perfection, as John Wesley would say, that they stepped into a space where they could know good from evil, and then had to start dealing with the fact that good and evil existed both around them and in them. And the problem sometimes with original sin theology is we do things like, I've been baptized, or I've been saved, I've been fixed from that, but you haven't, so you're the one with evil still, and I'm not. And we use it as a way of being able to wash our sins, but not to wash the world.
And what sin is that when you say I've been saved and you haven't?
Rationalization. Right? Somehow we have to expect better of each other than that. I like how he said, how do you say it? That he believes in the reality of sin, of evil, but not in original sin.
And that would be, I think, my feeling about that.
So how do we change our way of thinking? Because there's still a whole lot of ease in assigning some people to be the lost. Right now in the political arena, it is not hard for me to see who is lost, right? Who's wrong. And I don't think that's helpful. It's just easy.
I think, I mean, it's easy for us to say that, but I have another problem that has to do with psychological problems with some people that no matter, so there are some people who just can't be saved. For whatever reason, there is something inside them that prevents them from and it's not necessarily something that they're doing something that's evil, it's that they have psychological problems that they just cannot overcome. And
Right.
I wonder about, you know, where is their place in the world? And in God's universe, because I don't believe that God has done this to them individually. And there are some people who have had all kinds of wonderful help and still they are lost.
Right. And that's because there's several things that I think.
And they were viewed as evil in the past.
Yeah. Right. There's several things that we have to figure out with that. So if we go back to students, what is it that we do with the different type of students that are there? Some people are just not at the level of the next grade, right? So what do we do with that child at that point? You know, the one thing we know about retention is that it works 50% of the time.
Yeah.
We just don't know who it works with and who it doesn't work
Who
with.
it's going to work
And
with.
so we automatically assume we have a perfect answer, and we go to that answer and say, we'll just retain all these kids, or we'll just pass them all forward, and neither one has a perfect solution. We have to figure out that even after we make a choice with somebody, that might not be right.
Yeah.
So part of the work that I've done was with Adobe Mountain. That's a juvenile detention facility in the North Valley of Phoenix area. And these kids would be making amazing progress. You could see their souls healing from whatever had gotten them into that facility. And it'd come to their going home time. They'd serve their sentence. They'd go home and they'd be back in a week. And there were a couple different reasons for that. Because in the facility was structured and they could succeed there. And as soon as they got out, it was unstructured and they automatically fell back into bad patterns because they didn't have the structure around them. Right? But that was compounded by the fact that the people outside wanted them to be whatever they were.
Yes.
Tried to coerce them back into. And so they ended up right back where they'd repented of their sins and cleaned up their life and fixed their worlds, because they weren't yet at the place where they could be somewhere else. And so you're right that in a very real way, we can't, even though we want to, we can't just automatically assume that this is perfect, no matter how much we want to. But it's because of that, and because of some of those things that seem to be so endemic in human beings, things like greed, anger, violence, all of those kinds of things which seem to have such dire results in our world. And we just assume that there must be, that evil can be only defined a certain way. But what if it's different? And how do we get to that different? It doesn't help when we have a church, like Pam was saying, that uses this type of thing to protect itself. When a church becomes, I am the one who saves you from all of that, so give me power, give me money, give me status. When that religious institution becomes one more expression of not quite perfect behavior. I watched a movie yesterday about 6 men who, when they were preteens, 12, 13, 14 years old, were sexually abused by their priests. And almost universally, the priest said something along the lines of, you want to do this because I'm your religious authority. You want to do this because this will make you right with God in some way or another. And so your question, Pam, is a huge one. What do we as the church get out of this, that we continue to perpetuate that type of behavior in us, not in them, but in us? If I'm the solution to the evil of the world, if I hold salvation, church, or I hold the God who holds salvation, at least, suddenly I have the power.
Well, if one of the things that you were talking about with evil, greed and that, I think included in that is controlling, trying to control everyone else, and certainly the church is guilty of that.
But I'm good in church. That's the problem, is we tell ourselves that, don't we?
Yeah.
So somebody else is controlling, I'm fixing that.
Yes.
And by taking this story of how everyone else is evil, but I have the solution, the original sin, the solution to original sin, I perpetuate my own sin. That which is not fixed within me, not as an individual, but as an organization. Because at least part of the problem is not individual sin, it is organizational sin.
Yes.
It is inherited, generational practices. We know, for example, that almost always that when somebody is abusing their children, we can find abuse in their background. Almost 100% of the time, can't we?
Yes.
And so that's all inherited sin. So there's that which continues to perpetuate that way. And how do we not ignore that, even while fixing this person, right? Saving this person? How do we acknowledge that some of that was not just his or her fault? Instead, we do things like, to go to our other topic, we go to things like the virgin birth. And we continue to build up stuff around the good side of things and build up, this is why this is right. And we build up larger mythologies about the goodness. So Jesus has to be perfect, right? So he's the child of God, not the child of a human being. But then when we figured out that the woman contributes just as much DNA,
I loved that. I loved that.
suddenly we
The
have to
church
come
had
up
to
with a new solution.
backpedal. Yes, the church had to backpedal, didn't they?
Yeah. That somehow humanity couldn't rise to the level of divinity, but that we had to somehow change that all around. The hard part about that is, so Mary has an immaculate conception, but you have to go further and further and further back if you truly want to fix all that. So you go back all the way to Adam and Eve. Ultimately, if you bring the argument to its conclusion, oh, the tangled webs we weave. So how do we
And swear by.
and swear by? All of this that we're talking about, you're exactly right, Judy. All of this is so endemic around us and within our institutions, not just religious institutions, but the way it plays out in the rest of the institutions around us, that we really have a hard time figuring out how not to react in a way that sees sin and fixes it with punishment, thinking that punishment is going to fix everything. The hard part about punishment is, by itself, punishment is inherently non-relational. No matter how much your hand is hitting the butt of somebody else, that's a non-relational act.
Yeah.
Right? And ultimately, that act needs to be accompanied by something that is relational. And these two things we're talking about carry us way beyond that relational. Why is it that the human act of sex has become, because, in my experience, there were two things that we knew were absolutely evil: sex and whatever somebody else did. Right? And so we take this inherently beautiful act of procreation and relationship, and we turn it into one of the most easily maligned things that are out there. And so we easily have people develop neuroses about an act that is one of the most human and, in a very real way, one of the most divine acts that we do. Because what are we doing in that ultimately is we're creating life, right? And not just the physical life, but also the spiritual life between the two people involved in that act. And yet that's one of the most maligned places, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I think there's a big chunk of healing that happens in sexual intercourse too. And that never gets talked about.
I think you're right.
I think it's physiological as well as spiritual and emotional. And I mean, at its best, not as a power thing. But I think its intention was even wider than procreation. It was for our good, our best interests.
Well, I think that's what, we probably all believe, but just think about the Catholic Church especially, that their feeling about sex is that it's so bad that you only should have it unless you're intending to have children.
Yeah.
You're only using it to procreate.
Yeah.
And to me, that cheapens the sex.
Absolutely. I'm reading a book right now that's about Celtic spirituality, and specifically it's dealing with the time between the 400s and the 800s, dark ages, where it became very clearly that sex was the evil
Yes.
that was perpetuating.
Somehow they conflated the idea of sex with the taking of the apple. That sex has now become the disobedient act.
Yeah.
Not the eating of the apple, as the snake had suggested they should do.
Yeah, one of the phrases that was used in this book, which was quoting someone way back when, and this was an official edict, because the Celts were much more of an earthy, physical type of spirituality, and the Roman spirituality of the main church was
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
And so it was like, sure, have sex, but don't have any pleasure in it.
Yeah, right.
If you begin to enjoy it, then you're sinful. And why is enjoyment inherently wrong, in the church's eye? Why? Because I think it's where the church loses control. Just the physical act of sex and the climax, where we all have that moment of completely uncontrolled, like, where it's just beyond us. I think that's really hard for a very controlling body like the church. And so to put it in the fact that might be of God is really hard for us as a church. And yet, procreation or enjoyment of life, either of the functions of sex, I think feels very much of God to me. But of course, we take sex out of the equation with Mary, because our Lord couldn't be created out of that dirty act.
No.
Never had sex before or after,
Oh,
because
that was the other thing, or after.
yeah, like somehow that would cheapen the act, even if it was the miraculous act of God impregnating her, that somehow having stuff afterwards would do that.
Well, part of that, I mean, I really, there's a real sense of hatred of women, particularly in the early times, that they're seen as evil because they're equating all women with Eve, who was the one who led poor stupid Adam
Yeah.
into disobeying.
Yeah, it became a really simple scapegoat, didn't it?
Yes.
So is
Especially,
that hate? Sorry, Jim, is that hatred or is that fear?
good question.
I think there's a whole lot of fear in that dichotomy, that we really just don't understand each other.
Well, and I think it's especially becomes clear as fear if what I have to do is strip half the people in the world of power, of credibility, and just negate everything about them in order to control the world. That's inherently a fear-based organization, right? And yet that's what we do again and again, right? Because don't get me wrong, I've known some individual women who I needed to be fearful of.
Yeah.
Talk about me like that.
But to control a whole, half of our population, to subjugate half of our population, rather than say how does the whole of us, male and female, somehow proceed forward stronger than. The bad news is you haven't solved most of the issues, but you've got 5 minutes left.
Well, even though I don't know how they got to be so wise, I think some of the younger generation who are switching to the pronouns and exploring the fluidity of sexuality rather than the
Binary.
the gender thing is maybe an evolutionary step in the right direction, even though it's hard to accommodate to it language wise. I mean, it's hard, it's a new vocabulary, and that's always hard at an old age like mine. But it's when I watch it, I think, yeah, I think they're on the right track.
Right.
That some of that defensiveness and otherness may get blurred or dissolve or something healthy in that whole notion that it's a spectrum rather than two opposites.
I think you're right. It's a lot easier to make things be opposites than it is to think about somebody being on a continuum.
Right. And I think with both of these things, original sin and virgin birth, it was always taking the easiest route.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just figure out something simple and defend that tenaciously and change it readily as we move along to be able to defend it, rather than go the harder route of trying to figure out the vagaries of relationship and really do the hard work. And isn't that a really poor thing to say about our institution, church? That ultimately we're guilty of taking the easy route rather than the more difficult. We don't usually frame it that way because we say things like, we're the faithful ones, we're doing the really hard thing, everyone else is doing the easy thing. But the reality is institutionally, I don't think that's true.
Mm-mm.
And when we just control each other through things like this, are we truly bringing about transformation?
I think there's a lot to be said for that, because you've been talking about children. You can physically control a child, but you aren't necessarily transforming that child into thinking for him or herself.
Yeah. And I think especially like right now, one of the things I worry about right now is we're doing a whole lot of teaching to the test, right? We're trying to test all this stuff, and we're making kids remarkably good at testing well, but do they like reading? Do they continue reading?
Yeah.
Right? Do they continue learning? I'm not certain that they do. So have we really taught them well? At one point, Dr. Spong said this: the primary task of a faith community is to assist in the creation of wholeness, not goodness, wholeness.
Wow.
Isn't that a remarkable statement? Because I think we do a whole lot of let's help you be good instead of let's help you be whole.
And that circles back to that idea of completeness too.
Yeah.
Well, especially since the definition of good changes from person to person.
It does.
It's hard to be good for everybody.
And in very valid ways it changes. right? For most of us, running away from a burning building is the good and right act. For a firefighter, running towards that building is the right act. And neither one of those is a wrong act, but they are potentially oppositional in what's happening. But I think we do the same type of thing, saying this is the right thing to always do, where maybe there's fluidity in that we don't give credit for.
Those two behaviors look different, but the intent may be very similar in that safety is a big issue
Mhm.
for either one. One is trying to safeguard what may still be in or close to the fire, and the other is trying to safeguard themselves and other people out, maybe. So
Right. And I don't think most people, or maybe any people, would say either act was a wrong act. But there's a whole lot of where we do say that about each other in other areas. I look at people who have left church. And I think sometimes the most faithful action that they've taken in their life was to leave church. Now, from the church's standpoint, they want to say, oh no, that's sinful, that's wrong, that's moving the wrong direction, that's listening to the devil. But maybe it's not. Maybe that's what's bringing wholeness to them. But then that would mean that church would have to deal with the fact that they are not just the perpetuators of good, no matter how much good they do perpetuate, but that they're also perpetuating something else. It's much easier to locate sin outside of self rather than within self. Institutionally, that's more difficult as well as individually.
and I guess I think mostly what I see in somebody else, I also have in me. And that's the reason I can recognize it. So if I'm seeing bad behavior, it's probably because I'm either doing it or I'm tempted.
Oh, you've thought about it. Yes,
Yeah,
that's true.
I'm on the brink.
Yeah.
There's not much difference between us in that way.
Well, and that's why for Bishop Spong, it's very important to not write off sin. It's very important for him to say that this happens. We do not treat each other well all the time. We hurt. We make wrong choices. That evil does exist, but that it's not that type of, not how we have located evil and how we have defined it. I think we have to get better definitions of those kinds of things.
Well, and then there's a sin of omission and a sin of commission too. You know, that we usually think of sins of commission because we feel like, you know, somebody got hurt because of that. But if it's something you should have done and you didn't, then that's considered a sin of omission. And I must say, a lot of times when I see somebody, you know, doing something against the environment, I consider that sinful.
Yeah. And if we look at, like, for example, my conservative friends that are against any kind of border work, right? You can't perpetuate that evil that they are by coming here. Well, I believe that's very holy work to go and care for folks that are there, whether or not they made wrong choices, whether or not their actions were whatever. But for them, it's really easy to be able to say, well, helping is the sin. No, I think not helping is the sin in that case.
And sometimes those people are there on the border because of sins committed by Americans with their businesses.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't want to admit that.
We don't want to admit that. It's because it's always much simpler to locate sin outside. And I think that religion ultimately asks us to deal with the imperfections within and to be honest and in community around those things, right? Because sometimes it's those things that are the very heart of. How many have ever had somebody in your life that was really kind of outside the mainstream, but was just your favorite aunt because she, or, you know, your favorite cousin because he acted this way, or whatever it was, because they were outside of they taught you something more than just what everyone else was able to help you to know.
I know that, or I feel that a lot of the people who are against all of the immigrants coming in sort of feel like they're in the life, we're all in the lifeboat and we don't want it to be overcrowded because everybody's going to drown. I don't think we're at that point yet, and I don't, but on the other hand, nobody is trying to find some other lifeboat for these people. That's the bigger part of the problem.
Yeah. And I think that that's a huge thing about it. The limited amount of reward or positive that we say. It can only be this much. Only so many people can be saved. Only certain things can happen. Why is it that we limit the divine action in the world to a small section rather than to the infinite side of things?
We have no imagination.
We have no imagination, right?
We are thinking that God is like us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's the problem there, that God.
There's at least part of the problem, and we need to end. It's our time is up, but there's at least part of the problem that says that deals with limited resources. There's only so much room in heaven, so not everyone can get in.
As a person who has been leading the religion and theology class, I can tell you there is a lot of room in this universe.
There is.
And I don't think there's a limited room in heaven.
Yeah, and even, Pam, in our religious depictions, there's a lot of room. So, for example, the book of Revelation at the end talks about the holy city of God, right? And the gates of heaven, essentially, that are there. And we depict that very often as St. Peter sitting there behind a concierge desk and everyone in a line to come in, right? The depiction in Revelation is very, very different. And I can't remember the exact dimensions, but it is literally hundreds of miles on each side. Okay? Huge, huge city, first of all. Plenty of room for everyone. Okay? And on each side, there's 3 huge gates, enormous gates. The gates of heaven, where St. Peter sits and judges everyone. But here's the thing that's interesting. The gates are always open because it says the gates are open during the day and God is the sun, and so there is no night.
Ah.
And so these gates that we typically say are shut off and only let certain people in are continually open, letting everyone in. And we don't want to, for some reason, it's easier for us to write off people instead of seeing an unlimited action of God.
Isn't part of that, and I'm not sure what book it comes from, but the one about the rapture when it only is 700 times 700 or whatever it is that people have calculated, and that's one of the reasons why they think there's no room in heaven.
Yeah, that's also from the book of Revelation. It's 144,000. And you know where that number comes from? 12 times
other than, what's that?
12 times 12,000. 12,000 come from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 come from the tribe of Gad, 12,000 come from the tribe of
Ah.
Asher. Each of the 12 tribes each gets 12,000 people. And we write that off as a very small number, forgetting that in most of the ancient world,
That was a
a
large
large
number.
city was a few hundred people. So 12,000 was an enormous number from each of the different tribes. And then if that was not enough, it says this right after the 12 times 12. Let me just read it to you here. It says this. I'm almost there. After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white with palm branches in their hands. So if he didn't make it clear in the unlimitedness of the 12 times 12,000, he also says, and there's a great multitude. So guess what? It's for
And
everyone.
people from all languages and all places. Why aren't we hearing this so much that
Why don't we speak that better? And
they're not all European white people?
That's right. All right. So we've determined that original sin doesn't really exist, and that neither of you are virgins.
That's for sure.
Anything else we need to solve?
Not today.
All right, my friends. Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.